I am thrilled to be here today because I am so excited to talk about supporting nurses. And in that conversation, I've got three experts with me today. First, I'd like to introduce Michelle Young Schellinger. Welcome, Michelle. Next, I'd like to introduce Annie Brower. And lastly, Adisa Perez. So, we are all here on behalf of Amplity Health. And I think it's important that we give you some context on who Amplity is. Amplity is a contract commercial and medical organization. As such, we support manufacturers through all phases of the product lifecycle. In many instances, we provide outsourced talent, like the women you see on this panel. Additionally, through our learning business line, we provide skills development to support both our Amplity colleagues and our clients' teams. Amplity has employed over 700 nurses in the past 5 years and provided training to hundreds more, making us experts in the skills necessary for nurses to succeed in industry. So when we move on, let's think about why this is such an important topic for the pharma industry. Nurses play a critical role in keeping patients on therapy. Imagine fighting to get a drug to fruition and then to get it on formulary and then fighting to get that script written and filled, all for the patient to discontinue because of an unexpected adverse event. Nurse teams help mitigate those instances by working with the patient care team to help better prepare their patients. Yet many nurses who come into the field with enthusiasm from clinical care hit roadblocks on the industry side. That's because they've never received the training and the skills they need to succeed. That's what our session's about today. So I want to get into our topic, but first I'd love to hear from you. On your screen, you will see a poll. Please help us answer this question. As you know, being part of a medical or sales organization for a pharma company is very different from working at bedside. So I'd love to know, what do you think the biggest challenges that nurse educators face when transitioning from bedside to industry? We'll give it just a moment and then Owen will share us the results. Okay, so we had a few people say that they need to develop skills unrelated to direct patient care, being unable to share their own clinical experiences when speaking with HCPs, adjusting to making a difference, and helping patients in a more indirect way. And many of you, in fact, the vast majority of you chose all of the above. And I think we would agree that these are all skills that nurses need to develop as they move from direct patient care to industry. All right. So we'll move on to our discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We definitely want to hear from you, and we will be pulling those questions as the time goes on, so we can make sure that we answer those for you. We want to keep this as live and interactive as possible. So again, a Q&A function will allow us to do. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. So I'm going to ask if we go through the panel, and first, Michelle, if you could share with us your role within your organization.
Sure. Thanks for having me today, Cecily. As a clinical manager, as an education manager of a group of nurse educators, one of my core functions is really around coaching and developing that team. I look for skills that the team needs to meet their goals and objectives. And then I work internally with both Amplity's learning team and our client's learning team so that we have the content to help us really remain engaged with our care teams, our healthcare professionals, the extended care team members that we now engage with to talk about either the science of the medication, the patient standards of care. And some of those skills could be around the communication, strategic planning, account management. And then I also, on the client side, work to develop those HCP engagement strategies and those measures of success.
Thank you. And Annie, since you work directly with Michelle, I'd love to hear what your role is.
Perfect. Good afternoon. So I am a remote clinical educator.
I've been employed with Amplity since 2020, and this was my first role into industry after 18 years of bedside nursing. And what I do is provide clinical support and education to healthcare professionals around basically the adverse events, the safety profile of a specific oral oncology medication.
Thank you. And Adisa,
Hello, thank you. Actually, like Annie mentioned, I am also a clinical educator, oncology clinical educator. I do work face to face with clients. I can go into the clinics or do it via Zoom if they prefer. I actually joined Amplity about 2 years ago after over 20 years of oncology face to face in the clinic. And I did an assortment of different oncology treatments and all that. But um, yeah, so I support an oral oncolytic also, and my role is educating the clinical staff or anybody that touches the patients about adverse event management. And the biggest goal is to keep patients on drug longer with that education.
thank you. And Adisa, while we have you,
Mhm.
would love to know, what do you think nurses, nurse educators bring? How do you think they bring value to the pharma and biotech industry today?
Sure. So I think being a nurse educator, just saying the word nurse puts people at ease. So being able to walk into the clinic and differentiate ourselves from the oncology specialist or salesperson, um, being able to speak the language, excuse me, having that ability to have a conversation that just flows easily. We understand each other, the language, and then even just being aware of their busyness and the time that they have or the lack thereof.
So, putting people at ease, understanding sort of the ins and outs of how the clinic might work. Is that kind of what you
Yeah.
want to hear?
Yeah. And just, reading their cues. And if a nurse is, trying to walk out, then they're kind of busy. And if they're sitting down, then maybe they have a little bit more time, being respectful of that.
Understood. And I'd love your perspective, particularly as you're primarily engaging remotely.
Yeah. I mean, adding to Adisa for sure is that rapport, ability to build rapport quickly. Like you said, being able to talk nurse to nurse and to pick up on those cues, as well as learning how clinical practices work, especially from a remote capacity. I've actually been a nurse navigator, so I understand who the gatekeeper is, who's laying hands on the patient, whether it's the initial chemo teach or maybe triaging the patient phone calls. So really trying to understand who's involved with the patient at what point in their journey, and being able to do that just from the perspective of being the person that was interfacing with the patient. Secondly, I would say our objective is just so different than our sales counterparts. There really isn't a selling objective. It's that patient support. And I think that's just such a um, respected topic from our healthcare professionals. They know we're really here to support the patients, and being able to say, let's talk about that last patient in mind and make that connection around the patient versus anything else. You're just able to connect with them in a different way.
Yeah, that's great. And I love what you said about, having been in those roles and understanding who those people are and what their roles are in direct patient care, and being on that patient advocacy side of the house, and how that's so complementary to, what our sales or, even our medical science liaisons might be doing. I think, Michelle, to that point, I'd love to hear what you think the value is that nurse educators bring, because I know you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective, having more of a business background and not a nursing.
Great. Yeah. I think that, when you look at the industry, everyone plays a role. And if you think of the sales team, they're there to provide clinical study background, efficacy, the why behind the patient being on this particular medication, right? And then there's a handoff either to a health science liaison, a nursing educator, because now there's a teach back opportunity with the patient and the nurse or the person within the practice that is now going to interface with that patient either around their oral medication or an IO therapy. And then from there, it's that management of that patient's journey. So we come back in again to really paint that next set of strokes in the broader painting of what happens as that patient is on therapy. What happens when they experience a side effect? Is there a protocol within the clinical trial for this particular medication where maybe there's a hold, maybe there's a dose reduction? There could be other guidelines like the ASCO or the NCCN or other standards of patient care. Everything begins to be layered in because at the end of the day, you want that right patient on the right therapy for the right amount of time, right?
Yeah.
So you really do need a full team approach. You can't just have one person taking all of that interaction on within a customer. So this way, each person within a team serves a very critical role.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have a role to play in ultimately serving the patient. There's a question that came in through the chat, and Michelle, I think you're a great person who can help us answer it. Question is, are there requirements for the role of nurse educator, RN versus LPN or other allied HCPs?
Great question. I think that it really comes back down to the specific program and their accomplishments and what background is required. For example, if it were to be an oncology medication, you would want oncology nurses without oncology background. Similar if it was neuroscience, cardiovascular, or if it was an OR, maybe even a medical device, you would want to mirror your education staff to be similar to the care team and the expertise that they need to provide to that care team. That's not to say that you don't have opportunities within a clinical education role for pharmacists and other uh, LBNs, LPNs, other credentialed folks, but it truly depends on what the mission of that particular program is to the specific credential. And the industry has changed over the years.
Perfect. Thank you. There was another question that came up around being aligned against medical or commercial, and we will get into that shortly. But the answer is that nurse educator teams can be aligned within the commercial part of the business or within the medical part of the business, and we actually have people who represent both. So as we get into more of the conversation, we will address sort of some of those differences for the folks in the audience. But before we do, I just want to ask a quick question. And actually, this one's for, we'll start with Adisa this time. Adisa, when you made the transition from direct patient care, what business effectiveness skills did you need to develop most to make that transition?
Sure. So, I would say the biggest thing was presentation skills. Even though I was a nurse manager and was used to, running meetings and things like that, it's at a different level. It's not with people that you're comfortable with. So, being able to talk to a group, feel comfortable, have that courage and, stature, what have you. But then also knowing how to give a long presentation versus what we call our elevator speech, like a quick 30-second presentation. So I would think that was a pretty big skill to learn right off the bat.
I've heard you say that this role has made you an expert in presentation skills. And I think you're doing a great job, right?
Gotten more comfortable with time for sure.
Annie, how about for you?
I could think of a couple different things. The first thing that came to mind is just time management when I'm by myself. So being 100% remote, this is a very different role for me than being interfacing with patients and other coworkers all day long. So trying to find ways to have social outlets throughout the day and then really be able to keep my task at my job functions. The other thing I think is just account planning in general. A lot goes before, let's say, an online customer meeting, a lot comes afterwards. And that's kind of the bread and butter of where you learn, where you get set up for success. So learning how to work with my different field counterparts if I'm involved with them, understanding, and some of them can be sometimes territorial. What's the best way to come alongside with them, present that education, but also be the person that has the mic at the end of the day and is getting the people the clinical support that they need. So I think those two things. And just continuing to learn, right? I am knowing now, once again, I am not an expert in this. What I was an expert in is now gone. And I think that can be really hard for nurses to start over in their career or anyone to then say, I'm more of a novice. What can I learn? How can I read a virtual room? Help me understand since I'm not there. Um, am I doing, am I using filler words? Am I doing other things that's taking the attention away from what actually I'm saying in the important clinical pro that I'm presenting?
Thank you. And I love that you mentioned how you're not an expert, although, every day you become more expert, certainly, but that you had to recognize that there was a level of um, newness that you had to humble yourself almost to recognize that some of the skills that you used in direct patient care are not going to be the skills that you'll use every day in this business, and that's okay. And Michelle, I'd love your perspective as I know that you work with a lot of nurses and and often are hiring folks who are coming directly from direct patient care. What skills you think that are most critical when making the transition?
Absolutely. I think when you first make the transition from bedside into industry, those of us that have been in industry for some time forget there is acronyms and encyclopedias of internal terms and the whys and the who's and the hows, but there's also a very different compliance. There's a compliance absolutely in medicine and in bedside care, but now we have the guardrails of the package insert. We have the other organizations within the FDA and your client's regulatory, what we can say, how we say it. So there's a lot of layers that begin to come in that when you first come in, it can be a little shocking into industry to say, well, what do you mean? I just wanted to talk nurse to nurse and explain this and this. It has to be rooted back. It has to be cited back to guidelines or to the package insert. So sometimes that's the first challenge. And then your soft skills, communication skills, building the relationship. They gave me a list of 100 people. Who do I call first? Who do I call next? When do I call them again? There are so many things that just after onboarding begins that continuous education process, that professional development. And that's where having learning and solution partners really comes into play to be able to come back offline and say, hey, my team is really struggling with something that coming from a sales background seems so simple to me, my routing. They don't understand an effective planning. How can I get them there? So then as you're building out a program to think of those very things that we may take for granted within the industry and mapping those out as a skill assessment.
That's great. And you're right. We do forget about all the acronyms and it's not, y- they're different. I mean, certainly there are plenty of acronyms in a clinical setting, but they're different acronyms. And the fact that, all of a sudden you're walking into a space where it's, we're speaking a different language essentially. Um, so Michelle, I know I mentioned it a moment ago, but your team is aligned against through the commercial part of your organization. Um, One of the questions was sort of how does that this is one of the questions that came up in chat actually was um uh sorry, I want to make sure I read this right. So is that common to be aligned through the medical part of the organization as opposed to Adisa? I know your team is aligned through the I'm sorry, let me do it again. You all are aligned through commercial, Michelle and Annie, and Adisa, you're aligned through medical. And I guess my question is, do we think that there's any uh, system that's more common? And I guess a follow-on question, and Adisa, because now you're showing up on my screen, I'll ask you first. And the follow-on question is, who are your typical clients? So somebody was asking, are you educating RNs, APPs, pharmacists, MDs? So I think there are two questions, like particularly coming up through the medical side of the house, who are you calling on? And then Annie, I'll ask you the same question coming up from the commercial side of the house.
So I will talk to whoever will listen. I want the front staff to know that I can educate or get whatever they might need in relation to my product. So even if it's the receptionist, I will talk to them so that they remember me. I can talk to medical assistants. They see the patients, they take the medication reconciliation, they hear those drug names. I obviously talk to the nurses, there's practitioners and physicians, anybody that touches the patient truly so that they are aware of the side effects to expect and how to handle it. The discussions, of course, are different with everyone depending on where they are and, their different levels and such. But I'll talk to whomever, wants to talk to me. But when I walk into a clinic, if a physician doesn't want to talk to me, that's 100% okay. Like, I'm not offended by it. My job doesn't, I can't, it's not like, oh, you didn't talk to physician today, so it doesn't count. I can talk to whomever as long as I'm providing something of value to their level.
Thank you. Annie, any similarities or differences?
Yeah. So I do also present to the clinical staff. So and we kind of use the clinical staff that's certified. And that can mean a lot of different things in this day and age. But also my role is both proactive and reactive in terms of I'm here to present information about how we can best help patients tolerate this medication, but I also am available for any quick phone calls around a host of other things. And like Adisa said, that can come from the providers. Sometimes those are providers calls. Sometimes those are new staff members, new nurses. Sometimes those are certified MAs or pharmacists. So really, again, up to each clinical practice of who is following that patient and on what part of that patient journey.
Thank you. And then I guess, Michelle, the follow-on question around structure, again, I know your team is structured around commercial, other teams might be around medical. Do you think that there's any preference there, I guess, from an organizational standpoint? And what has your experience been?
I think that it comes back down to who the audience is going to be and the guardrails within that audience. When you think of where we are in a regulatory world, making sure that nurse educators are not in any way in a promotional setting, that even though we may be in a commercial space, we are not promotional. We are directly to very specific sections of that package insert and the relating guidelines that may go into that area based on the protocol and the clinical trial. So we are often bound by who we're speaking to and what we're speaking about. And that sometimes will determine where within an industry or organization your team may sit. There may be other clinical educators that are providing a very different role, similar to a health liaison, where they're speaking about other things outside of an approved drug. Their guardrails may be very different. You also may have clinical educators or nurse educators who are patient facing. So again, it comes back to the audience and the regulatory compliance behind the scenes that goes into what we can and can't speak to for that particular audience.
Perfect. And actually mentioning compliance, there's a question in the chat around compliance. How did you all learn the specifics around compliance? Is that something that um, was taught by your individual clients or by Amplity, or did you find it elsewhere in the public domain?
Great question. I'll take a first stab at that
Sure.
if you like. In our onboarding, both within Amplity and then with our client, I would say there is a robust section of training around the pharma code. So if you are coming into the industry, I think understanding the pharma code, the role of the FDA, the role of DD-MAC may help you have a foundational knowledge to then launch into other conversations. Friends of mine that work in the hospital say it's no different than the guidelines that a hospital may have, JACO, whomever. There are guidelines in place. And that's a good place to start, would be understanding the pharma code and how that really directs us into what engagements we have and don't have.
Thank you. And I think that really, a couple of things you've mentioned so far, Michelle, really lends to one of the things that, we at Amplity Learning are really proud of, is that we lean in to support our teams in those skills. So it might be something like compliance and like bringing some of the compliance regulations to life. Or as you mentioned earlier, it may be something around those business effectiveness skills, like the business acumen around routing, or around presentation skills, which is something that we absolutely lean in with our teams and with our client teams to help develop those skills in our nurse educators. So thank you. I'm going to flip it back to Adisa and Annie for a second. And Annie, I'm going to ask you first. There's a question in the chat that says, what's the most challenging transition from a traditional nursing role to an industry role?
I mean, I think this is going to be different for every person. So personally, for me, um, I would say some of it is just starting over and being a novice in something, and having to learn, like Michelle said, a whole new workbook of acronyms, trying to feel comfortable in what I'm saying, and knowing that is compliant. And then the other part that comes to mind is just being a nurse and knowing, you know what, my patient needs 8 milligrams of this medication and they're going to start feeling better. Even though I might know that, I can't say that. So trying to feel how to engage with that nurse on the line within those guardrails of what you can say, even though you have that clinical knowledge, and you might know what it is, figuring out the best way to connect with them around the prescribing information or the resources given.
Thank you. And Adisa.
Yeah, I think that she makes a good point. We have to remember that even though we know and we're nurses and we've been there, done that, can't give suggestions. We can refer them back to the treatment guides or PIs, whatever material that is out there and approved that they then, kind of interpret into how they want to use it. We can guide them along the way. This is where to find it, but we can't provide, of course, any medical suggestions. But and that is, I mean, we get a lot of training on what to do and what to say and not say. So it definitely is in your head and you remember it, but it still can be a little tough. But yeah.
And it's such a thing that's ongoing learning, right? You might just not be put in a situation for a couple of years. And now all of a sudden you're in a room being asked a very pointed question with maybe
Yeah.
someone that shouldn't be in that room with you. So you think you learn it in the beginning and onboarding, but it's definitely an ongoing learning opportunity to keep yourself safe as well as your team safe. Um,
And it
you
helps
know,
then also to open the doors for others. If they're asking a question that we can't answer, even though we kind of know the answer, we can simply say, I can't discuss that with you, or I don't have information on that, but I can bring in, so and so and so and so to help you out. And, it opens the door for them and they'll still get their questions answered as the provider, but then it provides another opportunity for a touch point for someone else.
Yeah. And Adisa, you just brought up something interesting. And Annie, you said it earlier, talking about bringing in, your internal counterparts. And Annie, you talked about the collaboration and how sometimes that can be a little challenging to navigate. I think speak to that a little bit because, and I'll have Annie go first. But if you could speak to what could make that a little bit challenging, because again, that's a space where we're finding, from a learning perspective, we're really leaning in and that sort of matrix collaboration space because we recognize that with so many types um, of roles, sometimes finding out what lane we all play in can be challenging. So I'd love to hear from each of you on that in that regard. But Annie, we'll start with you.
and I would say, as being here for 4 years, it's definitely changed. Where you are on day one can look very different where you are on day 4 in terms of your confidence, and when you speak up. So I would say that first part, I just tried to absorb as much information. I felt like I was there to be a part of the conversation, learning that maybe the West Coast interacts a little bit differently with industry than the Midwest than the East Coast, and at what point I have been aligned with all of those. Figuring out time zones. When's the best time to engage a nurse? Does she want to have a field counterpart on the line, or does she just want to talk with me? Um, I would say, those two things, and just being open to learning. I'm not an expert. What my counterpart John versus Mary wants, for how to me to interact and to come in and say, this is me, this is my role versus, hey, I am want to present as a one approach. I work with John, so I'm here to kind of represent both, but my role is different in terms of how to keep patients on therapy. And that's really where I come in. So just having really clear introductions, I think is so important. I'm not here to take the conversation away from anyone else. If anything, I'm here to engage different, maybe patient care members than they are. But then also saying, let's schedule a follow-up call right afterwards. That debrief, that pre-call plan and that debrief, I think has been so important in kind of creating successful business with my counterparts.
You know what I'm hearing you saying is that you have learned to tailor your not only your messaging but also your approach to, both internal and external stakeholders. And again, those are skills that are developed. And I'm sure that some of that happens in direct patient care. But again, when you layer in the compliance piece and the fact that we each have, very specific roles to play, that layer of complexity may change when you come to industry. And that's another set of skills that, we can help with because we've got folks who figured it out, and we can help other folks figure it out as well. Um, Actually, Michelle, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as a leader.
Sure. Cicely, I'm actually going to pick up the conversation right where you stopped. In the last year and a half, we have invested in our team's communication skills, looking at different industry leading coursework, whether it was homegrown within Amplity, off the shelf, things that we've done through other mechanisms of online learning, but really having that time, because I'm in a wonderful spot of my team. I don't have new except when we expanded our program. So
Right.
my staff have been with me since the launch of this program. So we're more now in that professional development phase, that polishing off our communication skills, diving into the personality and the role of the person we're engaging with, and tailoring our conversation to that person. Second to that is also healthcare has changed quite a bit since the pandemic. Offices have gone to not having a group of people coming through their practice on any given day. Everything may be through a third party service of scheduling an appointment. It's very precise because they don't want to take time and resources away from their patient focus, right? So this also gives us an opportunity to then really think about who is going into the practice, when they're going, what are they discussing, and what enhancement can I layer in? If it's piggybacking in with the field representative, the key account manager, and coming in with a one company approach, or is it more of a one off? And that's the nice part between Annie and Adiza's roles, is that they can be in person when needed for Adiza, or online and Zoom for Adiza and Annie. So we're meeting the customer where the customer is, instead of us kind of forcing ourselves upon them that, hey, I'm here and I'm going to nurse educate you for the 15 minutes. Please focus on me. We're taking a very different, I like to say precise medicine is not just about selection of molecule on the patient, but it is also now incorporating itself into how we communicate, what we communicate, the type. Is it an online engagement with a click through? Is it something where the person goes online and says, hey, I do have a question. Let me push a button and connect to someone within those companies that are using that technology. So it is always about the evolution of this role and the changes that we have seen in these last 5 years.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I think we're spurring some additional questions in the chat. So one came up around pre-call planning. So the question, and Adisa, I'll ask you, is what are some approaches to pre-call planning? So Annie, of course, mentioned, her pre-call plan and how important that was. I'd love to hear for you, kind of what's your approach to pre-call planning?
So of course, I access my site and see, what provider I'm going to go see, not necessarily just what clinic, but what providers are there, what tiers they are. Um, you know, I usually will check that there's a function where we can check like the calendar. So maybe when was the last time another team member was there, not a clinical educator, but the oncology sales specialist. So can kind of see, am I coming in a little too soon, or is it about right time for a follow-up? Uh, I think those would be the biggest things for pre-call planning for me. And I always look up when I'm going to a new facility, I look them up online, I look for their pictures. So, if a provider comes in and they don't have their white coat on, I still know who they are. If it's my first time in the clinic.
Smart.
Yes, I look, oh, that picture looks familiar. But yeah, I think that's how I do my pre-call planning. And of course, I have conversations, weekly calls, or more as needed with my other sales counterparts, so we can discuss it. Hey, this is my schedule. Is there anything you want me to focus on? Is there someone I need to follow up with that you saw recently? So some stuff online on my own and then some stuff with my counterparts.
And to that point, obviously you have your own routing and your own plan, but it sounds like you also, as appropriate, if the sales specialist says that, hey, there's a need here specifically, you can lean in based on those conversations as well.
Yeah, yeah. Like if someone's just seen, oh, there's a new nurse at this clinic, I mentioned your name, that would be a good follow up for you. So then I'll make sure that I bring it back to them like, hey, you met my, sales rep the other day or last week or what have you. I'm who they were talking about. Here's my information. And vice versa. Sometimes I walk into a place, they'll say the sales specialist was just here
It's just
yesterday.
here.
Yeah. And usually that comes from physicians. And and I can just put them at ease by letting them know, okay, well, we work very differently. So here's how I can help. But yeah.
Excellent. Well, okay, so while you're spotlit, there's actually a question. I know there are a number of people in the audience who are interested in becoming nurse educators, maybe who are currently in direct patient care roles. So there's some questions around making that transition, but one of them was around your engagement as a clinical educator and whether your teams engage at all with patient advocacy groups or within the community. Is that something that either team does with any regularity?
I mean, as a nurse and being so where I live here in Pinellas County, Florida. So I'm a member of Pinellas County Oncology Nursing Society. I have been for 20 plus years as a nurse, and I'm still a nurse, even though I'm an educator and not in the patient setting. So I still go to those meetings. Um, and I can meet all kinds of people in those meetings, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, and absolutely. So through your network outside of your team and with outside of work, you have the opportunity to influence some of those patient advocacy types of engagements.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Annie, is that similar for you?
Not necessarily. And I would say every
Okay.
client, every organization is going to be a little bit different
Sure.
on this. And you're definitely going to see that when you're working with different accounts, that some align to that and some don't. So for the most part, my engagements, 100% actually are during the workday. I'm not engaging anyone outside for dinners or meetups like that. Everything, of course, is run through our leadership in terms of business need. But for the most part, no, my networking really comes from a more personal standpoint and being an oncology nurse, but not necessarily from my role with this specific oral medication.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the questions that was in the chat was in terms of making that transition. Hang on, I think I may have lost it. Hang on one second. Um, in terms of making that transition, are there professional organizations or educational resources that you might recommend? So I know that you're not, from a client's perspective, you're leaning into any other organizations, but just professionally, are there organizations that you might recommend someone who's thinking about making that change might want to lean into? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I don't have anything that comes to mind, but I think, as nurses, you always want to keep your contacts up. I definitely had people I know that were doing this sort of thing. And even if I think they're doing this, sometimes their role looks even completely different, whether that's patient facing. A lot of organizations maybe are, whereas ours is more that education from healthcare professionals. So I think just learning about the different roles, I do think LinkedIn is a wonderful place to kind of get exposure. But talking to people that are working in those sorts of roles, I don't think a
Yeah.
specific organization comes to mind.
Yeah, I don't have a specific organization either, but like Annie mentioned, I would say, leveraging the contacts that you already have, or if that's something that you're thinking of doing when those reps come in or other educators come in or pharma reps, pharma world people come in, ask questions. I mean, people are happy to give you information and contacts and leads, and just don't be afraid to ask them.
And of course, for those of you who are already in industry, certainly Amplity has a plethora of learning opportunities available. As Michelle mentioned, her team, we engage regularly with actually both of these teams to enhance their skills. So if you're already in industry and you're curious about enhancing your skills, please reach out because, you know, we may be able to support some of that as well. Particularly, as we talked about those business acumen, the presentation skills, the emotional intelligence it takes to be in this space, the collaborative skills are all things that, we can help when you've made that transition to industry, and we can help teams with. So I am shocked at how quickly our time has gone today, but we are at time. So I want to thank our panelists today. Thank you, Michelle Young-Schellinger. Thank you, Annie Brower and Adisa Perez, for your insightful conversation today. If you've heard anything that sparks some interest, we would love to hear from you. For more information, you can contact Lynn Policelli or myself, and we'd be happy to follow up. Visit amplity.com/learning/solutions. That was really hard for me to say, but you can see it on the screen there. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at our next event. Bye-bye.